Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look, a real deep dive into a conversation that, well, it pulls back the curtain on some of the biggest questions, the really debated ones in theoretical physics right now.
That's right. Yeah, we're digging into this Piers-Morgan uncensored debate. It was pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
And sometimes, yeah, pretty sharp.
Definitely. And the sources, they feature two figures who are, well, they're really good at making complex science understandable for, a wider audience.
hmm Dr. Eric Weinstein, he's known for his math background, his own theoretical ideas, and, of course, being a podcast host himself.
And Professor Sean Carroll, highly respected physicist, philosopher too, from Johns Hopkins University.
And they really, they got into it, covered so much ground. The nature of reality, the hunt for a unified theory, even like the health of the physics field itself.
Our mission then in this deep dive is really to unpack their arguments, try to understand where the friction points are.
Yeah, and see what their disagreements, what they tell us about how physics is working or maybe not working today.
It's kind of like eavesdropping on this really high-level scientific argument.
But one that gets right to the heart of how science actually happens,
Yeah.
What counts as progress? What questions should we even be asking?
Exactly. So let's dive in. The sources introduce these two. Eric Weinstein, known for proposing this theory, geometric unity. And you hear him a lot, places like Joe Rogan, Uncensored.
Right. And Sean Carroll, also a big communicator, Mindscape podcast, writes lots of books on cosmology, quantum mechanics, all the big stuff.
And apparently this was the first time they'd actually appeared together publicly to really sort of hash out these specific ideas face to face.
Which is interesting in itself.
Uh,
And the tone.
Yeah.
Civil, mostly. But you could feel this tension underneath.
Yeah.
A bone of contention, as it was described.
Yeah, it led to some pretty direct disagreements, accusations even.
Weinstein actually used the phrase physics fight club. The first rule is you don't talk about the problems.
Whoa. Okay, so that tells you right away, this isn't just about the math.
No, it's also a critique of the culture. Perceived problems within theoretical physics.
So not just about who's right about theory X or theory Y, but is the whole field maybe stuck or not working the way it should?
Exactly, which leads us right into one of the big sticking points, this whole quest for quantum gravity.
Ah, yes, the classic problem.
It's a standard story, right? Physics has these two amazing theories. You've got the standard model, covers electromagnetism, the nuclear forces, particles, the Higgs field.
And that's a quantum theory, through and through.
Right. Then you have Einstein's general relativity, our best take on gravity. But that's a classical theory, not quantum.
And the issue is supposed to be that they just don't play nicely together. They're incompatible somehow.
Yeah. The usual line is that gravity has, quote, resisted quantization. We haven't managed to fit it into that quantum framework like the other forces.
Okay, so what about that specific challenge? What did they say?
Well, Sean Carroll, his view is it's just a natural expectation.
Yeah.
That the world's quantum at its root. So gravity should be too, eventually. It's the default expectation, he called it. Physicists have been trying since the 50s, but, well, roadblocks, significant ones.
Right, but Weinstein, he really pushed back on that, didn't he? Said it wasn't the right goal, or maybe even the only one.
Pushed back hard, yeah. Called making quantum gravity the central goal a terrible crime, even. A fiction that sort of took over physics back in the early 70s, around 72, 73.
What a terrible crime. That's strong language.
It is. And he raised this really interesting point, challenging that standard story. He says the incompatibility isn't just quantum versus classical. It's there even in the classical versions.
Oh, how so?
He claims one framework, the standard model forces, fits into what's called a gauge theory. It's a specific mathematical structure. But general relativity, he argues, you can't successfully gauge it in that same way.
Huh. So it's not just gravity is hard to make quantum. It's more like gravity is fundamentally different structurally, even before you try to quantize it. And maybe that's why the standard methods aren't working?
That's basically his point.
Yeah.
Yeah. He talks about alternatives like quantum harmonization or even geometrizing the quantum, finding a totally new way to unify them instead of just forcing gravity into the mold that worked for the other forces.
Okay, so one sees the path as like the obvious next step we just haven't figured out yet.
Right. Keep pushing on quantizing gravity.
And the other sees the focus on that path as a huge mistake that's led physics astray.
Pretty much sums it up. A really stark difference in perspective on the history and the right way forward.
And that disagreement, it flows right into the next big topic, string theory.
Exactly. Because string theory is often pitched as, the leading candidate for quantum gravity, the thing that might bridge that gap.
Right. The basic idea, instead of point particles, everything's made of these tiny vibrating strings, loops or segments.
Yeah. And funny enough, it started out trying to explain the strong nuclear force back in the late 60s, early 70s.
But it kept predicting something else, didn't it?
It did. It kept predicting this massless particle with spin 2, which happens to be the exact description of the graviton, the hypothetical quantum particle of gravity.
So physicists sort of pivoted, like, hey, maybe this isn't about the strong force. Maybe it's about gravity. Maybe everything.
That's the story. And it comes with some pretty mind-bending concepts, like extra dimensions of space-time.
Yeah, ones we don't see because they're supposedly curled up incredibly small.
Right. Now, Sean Carroll's take on why it got so popular, especially around the mid-'80s, he really emphasizes this miraculous cancellation.
Cancellation of what?
Infinities. When you try to do standard quantum calculations involving gravity, you often get infinite answers for probabilities, which, makes no sense. The theory breaks down.
Okay. Physics doesn't like infinities popping up in answers.
Definitely not. So Sean highlighted these calculations by John Schwartz and Michael Green around 1984. In string theory, those calculations gave finite answers. No infinities, no anomalies.
So that was a huge technical breakthrough. It suggested string theory might actually work mathematically where other quantum gravity attempts failed.
That was the key insight, according to Carroll. He really stressed that physicists got excited because the math worked in this crucial way. It wasn't just, as he put it, being sheep following Edward Witten, who's a huge figure in the field.
Okay, so a technical mathematical reason for its appeal.
That's Carroll's emphasis.
But Eric Weinstein, he tells a different story, or at least puts the emphasis elsewhere.
He does. While he respects the intelligence of string theorists, he claims the whole field sociology turned on a dime around 83, 84. And he does attribute it much more to Edward Witten's powerful will and mind than just that calculation.
So more about influence and group dynamics.
Yeah, he sees string theory's dominance as part of this broader pattern he perceives, this collapse in progress.
And he also points out a major practical problem, right?
Yes. That string theory, despite all the theoretical work, utterly fails to connect directly with experiments.
The experimental verification problem still hasn't produced a testable prediction that's been confirmed.
Right. And Weinstein notes this is causing, quote, a lot of hair pulling, understandably.
So you solve one problem, the infinities, but you run smack into another connecting to reality, which brings us neatly to Eric Weinstein's own proposal, geometric unity.
Right. This is his alternative framework. The big idea is to unify everything: gravity, quantum mechanics, all the forces within one single geometric structure.
And it involves, what was it, a 14-dimensional space.
For 14-dimensional manifold, yeah.
Yeah.
It extends our usual space-time, and the idea is that particles and forces sort of emerge from the geometry of this larger space.
Okay, sounds ambitious. And this is where the debate got particularly sharp, right, over the status of this theory.
Extremely sharp. Sean Carroll was pretty blunt in his criticism. He said the theory is still largely unpublished in formal peer-reviewed journals.
Which is the standard way science gets vetted.
It is. And he said it hasn't been formally tested or widely accepted. He even pointed to things in Weinstein's own paper, like where it apparently says the author isn't a physicist, calls himself an entertainer, and describes the work as a draft, which may not be built upon.
Carroll argued that last part goes against how science is supposed to work. You want people to build on your ideas.
Exactly. He framed it as contradicting the collaborative nature of science.
Did Carroll have specific technical critiques, too? Beyond the publication status?
Oh, yeah. He claimed the paper lacks things physicists usually look for, like a Lagrangian, the core mathematical function describing the system, or details on how particles interact, or evidence the theory is even viable. Is it stable? Does it avoid anomalies? Does it give finite answers like string theory managed for gravity?
And predictions? Did he say it lacked predictions?
Yes. He claimed it didn't offer concrete, testable predictions for known puzzles, like why is the proton stable? What is dark matter? And, crucially, does it solve those infinity problems in gravity? He was also quite dismissive of relying on, say, YouTube analyses instead of evaluations by professional physicists.
Okay, that's a fairly comprehensive critique from Carroll's side. How did Weinstein respond?
He pushed back hard, disputed the idea it's not being taken seriously, claimed it's being discussed in physics departments.
Okay.
He accused Carroll and what he called a small group of influencers of spreading misinformation, of creating a climate of fear that stops people discussing his work openly.
A climate of fear. Wow.
Yeah. He insisted the paper does have predictions, tables, solves problems, basically suggested Carroll either hadn't read it properly or was misrepresenting it.
Did Weinstein offer any specific technical counterpoints?
He did mention one. He said if you take a Lorentzian metric, the map describing space-time and general relativity, and do something called pulling back Weyl spinors, you naturally get one generation of standard model fermions, like electrons and quarks.
And his point with that was...
His claim was, this shows general relativity knows the standard model in some hidden way, that his framework reveals this deep connection that others miss.
Interesting. And he also felt he was being held to a different standard.
Very much so. He argued he faces differential treatment, especially on predictions. Why demand them from him immediately when string theory, after decades, still lacks direct experimental confirmation, particularly at energies we can actually reach?
That's a fair point about the challenges facing string theory, too.
He also questioned Carroll's specific qualifications or standing in certain areas of physics as part of his defense.
Okay, so the whole geometric unity exchange wasn't just physics, it was about the whole process. Peer review, who counts as an expert, how new ideas, especially from maybe outside the absolute mainstream, get treated.
Absolutely. It really put a spotlight on the tension between the traditional academic system, peer review, publication, and maybe newer ways of getting ideas out there, especially complex ones still in development, and the role of personality and influence and all that.
Which loops back perfectly to that bigger question they kept circling. Is theoretical physics actually in crisis?
And on this, they had fundamentally opposing views.
Right.
Eric Weinstein. Absolutely, yes. He used terms like absolute collapse and the efficacy productivity at the deepest levels.
Collapse. That's dire.
He called it a self-evident crisis that everyone in the game can see. He described this toxic sociology, like a smart team versus a dumb team, where alternative ideas get shut down. It connects back to his physics fight club comment.
So for him, the lack of breakthroughs, the dominance of certain theories, it's all symptomatic of a broken system, a broken culture.
That's his diagnosis. Sean Carroll, on the other hand, he strongly disagreed with the crisis framing, at least in that sense.
What was his view?
He argued that academic physics is generally working in good faith. Researchers are trying their best on very hard problems. The established ideas, the establishment heterodoxy, as he put it, are dominant for good reasons, not just inertia or politics.
And he thinks the system is basically functional. Maybe not perfect, but functional.
Yeah. He acknowledged there are disagreements about which problems are most promising to work on, sure. But overall, he thinks the system works pretty well. He believes people are open to better ideas, provided they're presented rigorously and stand up to scrutiny.
So he denies this systemic crisis, this stagnation caused by sociology that Weinstein alleges.
He does. He pointed out that physics departments are pursuing various approaches, not just string theory. It's not as monolithic as Weinstein sometimes portrays it.
So it's either a fundamental breakdown stopping progress, or it's just that the problems are incredibly hard and the system is working as well as can be expected.
That's the core of that disagreement, yeah. A debate about the health of the whole scientific field.
Which is fascinating because it's hard for us on the outside to really know. Hearing both perspectives is really valuable.
Definitely. And from there, the conversation kind of broadened out even more, touched on some really big, almost philosophical questions about reality.
Like the simulation hypothesis? Are we living in a computer simulation?
Briefly, yeah. Carroll's take was pretty down to earth. He said, basically, he believes we're here along with tables and chairs. Seems like a no from him.
And Weinstein.
He called it a really good question, maybe more open to it, or maybe just enjoying the speculation.
They also talked about AI threats. And here, surprisingly, they found a bit of common ground, but with different focuses.
Yeah, Carroll's main worry right now isn't some future Skynet. It's people using the current AI, the less smart stuff, badly.
How so?
Out of laziness, basically, or thinking critically. He mentioned a trivial example like AI hallucinating a news story, but worried about it being used in ways that could actually hurt people.
Okay, misuse of current tech. What about Weinstein?
He agreed with that concern about lazy or misguided AI use, but he put it in a bigger context. He pointed to other, maybe larger existential threats, things affecting the shared atmosphere, pathogens, radiation, climate change.
A nuclear weapon.
Nuclear proliferation, yeah, which he explicitly tied back to physics itself, having unleashed thermonuclear weapons through political systems.
So both see AI misuse as a danger, but Weinstein frames it alongside these other massive self-inflicted risks.
Exactly. Then they moved on to everyone's favorite brain bender, time travel.
Ah, yes.
Carroll laid out the standard physics view, time travel forward, totally happens, we all do it. And you could speed it up relative to others if you go near light speed or hang out near a black hole. Standard relativity.
But going backwards.
That, he said, is conceivable in some theories, but not plausible, based on what we know. No evidence the required conditions exist. He's even written papers exploring the theoretical side, though.
Okay. Standard view for, yes, backward, probably not. What was Weinstein's take? Connected to geometric unity?
That was different. Because his framework apparently has multiple dimensions of time. Maybe 5, maybe 7 within his 14 dimensions overall.
Multiple time dimensions. Okay, my head hurts already.
Right, so he talked about times travel, plural, and he used this analogy. With multiple time dimensions, maybe governed by ultra-hyperbolic equations, you could potentially navigate to the past without rewinding through intervening time.
Like skipping tracks on a record, he said, instead of rewinding a tape.
Exactly that analogy, suggesting a way to reach past moments without violating causality in the way we usually worry about with single-time dimension models.
Wow, that's a radically different picture of time itself. Allows for possibilities standard physics doesn't really entertain.
It really shows how your foundational assumptions about space-time can lead to completely different conclusions about what's possible.
And finally, they tackled the ultimate question, didn't they? The before the Big Bang question. And does it point towards God?
Yeah, the host, Piers Morgan, framed it as, human brains can't grasp what came before nothing. Therefore, maybe we need a higher power.
How did Carroll react to that?
He disagreed right off the bat with the premise. He said the human brain can absolutely tackle that question. Just because scientists don't know the answer now doesn't mean the question is unanswerable by science.
Did he offer a possible scientific answer?
He mentioned his best guess involves a pre-existing universe, maybe eternal inflation, potentially infinite in time. But his bigger point was philosophical. He suggested questions like, what was before eternity? Might not actually be sensible questions.
How so?
He argued that scientific progress sometimes reveals that questions we thought were fundamental are actually, from a deeper understanding, kind of uninteresting or based on flawed assumptions.
That's a fascinating point. Science doesn't just answer questions, it sometimes refines or even discards them.
Precisely. It changes the landscape of what we even ask. Eric Weinstein also jumped in here. He suggested the host was mixing up different concepts.
Like what?
Like the edge of what we can observe, the surface of last scattering, the mathematical models we use, like the Big Bang singularity, which is just part of the map, and the actual assembly sequence that build reality itself, the underlying manifold.
Okay, distinguishing observation, model, and underlying reality. How did he connect that to God?
He speculated that maybe a future theory of everything, like he hopes geometric unity could be, might start from incredibly minimal inputs, just a few degrees of freedom.
And then
the only question left might be, why those specific minimal inputs? And that question, he suggested, might be where science hits a wall, where it becomes a question for philosophy or theology, the point upon which your God hinges, as he put it.
So he also acknowledged we don't know what was before nothing, but framed the potential limit of science differently. Not that the question is maybe ill-posed, but that science might lead us to a well-posed question it ultimately can't answer.
Yeah. Exactly. Two different takes on the limits and scope of scientific inquiry when facing ultimate origins, both agreeing on the current ignorance, but differing on the potential path forward and the nature of the question itself.
Wow. Okay, so pulling this all together, this deep dive into the debate between Weinstein and Carroll, what's the big takeaway?
Well, I think it just hammers home that theoretical physics is absolutely not some monolithic, settled thing. Even at the very top, you have these deep, passionate disagreements.
And not just about the answers, right? But about the questions themselves.
Yeah, about the goals, the methods, how you even evaluate a new idea. Is the field healthy or in crisis? Is string theory the best path or a dead end? Is geometric unity a breakthrough or underdeveloped? These are fundamental arguments about the scientific process itself.
We saw completely different views on the right way forward.
And it really shines a light on the human side of science, the personalities, the different standards people hold, how hard it is to challenge the status quo.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about.
For sure.
And consider this, thinking about Sean Carroll's point. If science can sometimes show that questions we thought were absolutely fundamental turn out to be maybe uninteresting or based on wrong assumptions,
Yeah.
what other big questions that we wrestle with today might eventually fall into that category? As our understanding gets deeper, which of our current ultimate questions might just sort of dissolve?
That's a really powerful thought, isn't it, about how much our perspective, even on what's worth asking, might change. The whole landscape of understanding just keeps shifting.